What should a passenger who finds themselves involved in an unruly passenger incident do?
Welcome to High Crimes and Misdemeanors, a podcast exploring the complex and ever-evolving world of aviation law.
Welcome to this episode of High Crimes and Misdemeanors. I'm Ed Page, and I practice aviation law at Carlton Fields, a law firm in Tampa, Florida. In this continuing series of High Crimes and Misdemeanors, we dive into criminal and regulatory issues that affect the aviation industry, from high-altitude incidents to high-stakes legal outcomes. Today, I'm joined by our summer associate, Avery Friedman, to explore one of the hottest legal topics in the skies, unruly passenger cases and the legal turbulence that extends far beyond a bad travel day.
Hi, everyone. I'm Avery Friedman, a summer associate at Carlton Fields, researching recent enforcement trends and how they're reshaping how we fly. I'm excited to be here today to talk about recent trends in unruly passenger incidents, which, speaking of, Ed, can you give those tuning in a quick recap into the trends following the COVID-19 pandemic?
Absolutely. Following COVID, back in the fall of 2019 and into the spring of 2020, and the high tensions around masking, where people were wearing masks everywhere, and particularly when air travel reconvened or restarted, we saw a drastic spike in the number of unruly passenger incidents. They've been around forever, but we really never paid attention to them until they started to get very frequent. The numbers of unruly passenger incidents went from about 1,000 per year in 2018, 2019, and 2020 to just shy of 6,000 unruly passenger incidents in 2021. So you can see the dramatic increase from 1,000 to 6,000 in just 1 year during COVID. Of those 6,000, 4,290 were mask-related disputes. You heard of them. You saw them. You probably may have participated in one of them, where someone wasn't wearing a mask and somebody else got mad and words were exchanged. Well, when words are exchanged like that at altitude, however, there's a big problem, because the crew doesn't know what's going on and whether that incident is going to go out of control. So, in 2022 and 2023, we finally saw a drop in the number of unruly passenger incidents, still way above what we had before, but with a drop from 6,000 to 2,500 in 2022, and again down to 2,100 in 2023. Where do we get these statistics? Avery and I don't count them. We rely upon the FAA website, faa.gov, who accumulates these statistics and publishes them on their website. And you can too. You can take a look if you're interested in doing that. To sum up, though, 2024 ended with about 2,100, and in 2025, we are on track for an even smaller total of unruly passenger incidents, as we call them. As of July 20th, 2025, we have had 902 unruly passenger incidents this year. So we're going from about 2,100 to maybe 1,600. That's what we're on pace for 2025. So we're continuing to see this drop. This drop in 2025 will be a drop of about 500 unruly passenger cases. 500 fewer, that is, than in 2024. Obviously, that's a big change. The FAA is happy. The Department of Justice is happy. And what we want to do is talk about them, because even though the number is dropping rapidly, we want to talk about various aspects of the unruly passenger incident, because now that they are on the FAA and Department of Justice's radar, they are getting scrutinized like they have never been scrutinized before. So, Avery, can you help us understand a little bit more about what's going on in the airline industry and carriers like American, Delta, and others, and how they are dealing with unruly passenger incidents?
I sure can. And it's interesting because despite a decrease in the number of incidents we're seeing and therefore the number of reports made by these airlines, enforcement by the Federal Aviation Administration or the FAA has actually gone up. We're seeing a greater percentage of reports being turned into investigations led by the FAA. And similarly, we're seeing a greater number of investigations leading to enforcement actions. And we'll talk a little bit about enforcement actions later, but these are things like fines issued as civil monetary penalties or federal criminal prosecutions. In 2021, when we saw that massive spike that you just discussed, of the 1,113 reports that were investigated, only 350 enforcement actions were brought. This is roughly 30%. So, though the number of enforcement actions has remained relatively the same, the number of enforcement actions brought in 2023 show that the conversion rate from investigation to enforcement action was actually 78%. And now we haven't been given numbers for 2024 yet in terms of this conversion rate, but we know from 2021 to 2023, we saw that 48% increase.
That's a huge increase, Avery. So I think it's interesting that despite seeing a drop in the number of unruly passenger incidents, which I know the FAA and the Department of Justice is happy about because they have a zero tolerance policy for this, and they bumped up their enforcement efforts, the FAA has not reduced its efforts and continues to bring a similar number of enforcement actions. Now, for those who are not familiar with this process and this narrow area of aviation law, there are two types of enforcement actions. The FAA, after an unruly passenger incident and an investigation and the conclusion of their fact-finding, can undertake what's called a civil monetary penalty action against the unruly passenger or passengers involved, seeking a monetary penalty. The only way to avoid that is to contest it on the merits. Normally, the passenger is faced with contesting it on the merits or paying the penalty, negotiating a penalty amount. And normally the FAA, in my experience, because I have handled quite a few of these, is only willing to reduce the penalty if the unruly passenger demonstrates conclusively through written documentation and the like that they have a financial inability to pay the penalty. Other than that, the FAA, in my experience, is quite rigid about the penalty they seek. I think we need to talk just a little bit so that our listeners understand that these penalties are not $500, $1,000, or $5,000. I've seen them anywhere from $10, $15, $20, on up to $65,000 in the unruly passenger cases that I've handled.
This is all very interesting. Do we know what determines whether a civil monetary penalty is issued as opposed to a federal criminal prosecution referral?
I'm a big fan of this phrase, and that is, in police work, they call these clues. So I want to give you some clues that help people understand what the FAA is focusing on. There are not really guidelines. The Department of Justice, for example, follows a U.S. Attorney's Manual and the guidelines in that for criminal prosecution. But what we're focusing on right now is what stimulates or piques the FAA's interest in an unruly passenger incident. And so I'd like to give you some information about that, about what the FAA seems to focus on. And the big one for me is that, interestingly enough, the FAA has pulled back on the information it releases to the public on its website. They used to list, you see, the civil monetary penalties, including the names of the passengers and the amount of the penalty that the FAA imposed in various cases. This was early on in the post-COVID area, 22, 23, and I haven't seen any in a couple of years. They were out there. You could look at them on the FAA's website, and then all of a sudden one day they disappeared. So it's hard to keep track of what the FAA is doing. You might have to make a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act, as it's called, to find out what penalties have been imposed in matters, because the FAA no longer posts that on their website. But we have seen some parameters from other agencies, although IATA defines unruly passengers into two categories: level 1, verbal offenses, and level 2, physical incidents. Though we don't know what determines whether a case is prosecuted criminally, the actual federal criminal cases are, of course, public. You can find these on the docket system that the federal system uses. It's called PACER, P-A-C-E-R. And we looked at the 10 most recent Department of Justice federal criminal prosecutions and conducted what we called a case study to identify any trends or similarities. Avery, can you give us, in the audience, our listeners, a breakdown of what you saw and what you found when you looked at these criminal cases?
Definitely. And so, in reading the 10 most recent federal criminal prosecutions, I counted the different numbers and sort of tried to spread them into categories, even though each case is quite different. 6 of these 10 cases involved assaults against a flight crew member, whether that be attempted or actual. 2 out of these 10 cases also involved physical violence against another passenger. This could include somebody that they were traveling with or somebody that they were seated next to. Additionally, 6 of these 10 cases also involved some sort of safety concern to the flight. And I think this is the most common way that unruly passenger cases, or at least of these 10, unfold. They include threats to the safety of other passengers or the safety of people on board, as well as attempts to breach the cockpit, as well as open aircraft emergency exits or doors.
Okay, and I would add that sometimes if there is a diversion, the flight is en route, let's say hypothetically from New York JFK to Miami, and there's an unruly passenger event on board. And as Avery has just said, there's now a safety concern because of the magnitude of the unruly passenger incident. There could be what's called a diversion and a landing, let's say in Charlotte, North Carolina. If there's a diversion, that is a good indicator that there could be a federal criminal prosecution, because that gives the crew and the facts, you see, more power to show that there was a safety concern, perhaps a well-founded interference with a crew member or another violation of one of the statutes. But Avery, while we're talking about federal criminal cases, why don't you help the listeners understand what kind of criminal sanctions are imposed in these cases so they can understand the magnitude of the violation here and better understand that this is serious business?
I want to give 2 examples. I want to give an example that really just involves somebody who is intoxicated and behaving in a way that only impacted the people around them rather than the safety of the whole flight. And then I also want to give sort of more extreme examples so we can see the 2 ways that this played out. So the first case that I want to discuss was on board a flight late last year. An intoxicated passenger was traveling with their spouse, then began yelling incoherently and striking their spouse in the shoulder and chest area. Flight crew asked the passenger first to move to the rear of the plane, who then refused, so the spouse ended up moving. And this passenger continued to flail uncontrollably, hitting their head on the seat in front of them and causing a danger to the passengers seated within the close area. This defendant was charged with interference of a flight crew in violation of 49 U.S. Code Section 46504. This is the code that governs these unruly passenger cases. It's called interference with a flight crew member. A sentence for interference with a flight crew member carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. However, some of these cases end a lot lower than that. In this case particularly, the defendant pled guilty and has been sentenced to 12 months of probation, a lot lesser of a sentence than that maximum 20 years. This sentence of probation included substance abuse assessments and outpatient treatment upon recommendation by the court based off of the involvement of alcohol in the incident. Now, moving to the second example I want to discuss. This was in 2023, but another passenger was on board a flight, also intoxicated, and became aggressive and used profane language toward the flight crew following an announcement made that passengers are prohibited from consuming personal alcohol on board the aircraft. Now, this announcement was prompted by a flight attendant who smelled alcohol in the area of the passenger and wasn't sure who was responsible and where it was coming from, so made a general announcement. Following those aggressive comments, a female flight attendant then let the defendant know that the police would be called upon arrival. As cursing at flight crew is not tolerated, the defendant made some lewd comments back to the flight attendant, additionally stating that the police would have to catch them first. Following that interaction, the defendant moved to the rear of the aircraft, interacting with another flight attendant, when the defendant then threatened the safety of that first flight attendant from the initial interaction. They stated that they wished to assault that first flight attendant. Later on, the defendant's spouse then proceeded to try and take a bottle of alcohol from the defendant's possession, which led the defendant to attack their spouse. This caused a physical altercation between them, with other passengers getting involved to break them up. Additionally, other passengers following the physical altercation stated that the defendant made reports and comments that he had a firearm on board and made comments suggesting threats to the safety of all passengers and safety of the aircraft. Upon continued threats and disruptions, the flight was then diverted. As we spoke about earlier, the flight landed. It was headed toward Newark Airport and landed elsewhere. The government originally charged this defendant with interference with a flight crew member, as well as assault on a spouse aboard an aircraft. The government then dropped this assault charge, and the defendant pled guilty to interference with a flight crew member, as we discussed, 49 U.S. Code Section 46504, and was sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation, and was ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $17,000.
Right, and we should add that we take these facts from various documents that have been publicly filed in the federal criminal justice system, such as a docket sheet, a plea agreement, a charging indictment, a charging information, and the like, but we still characterize them as allegations, and we're not saying that this actually occurred, but that was the government's allegation that provided the factual basis for what occurred and how that case was resolved. So, Avery, thank you for that. But I think it's important for us to spend some time focusing on this issue of diversion. I've said before, and you just mentioned it, that in police work, in unruly passenger cases, it's a valuable clue, because diversion can really, when the flight diverts, can get you criminally prosecuted. And if not, the FAA is much more inclined to impose a civil monetary penalty, because it shows that the safety of flight was in jeopardy. So as you might have noted, one of these cases involved diversion while the other did not. In our survey, the study, 50% of the federal criminal cases from our case study also resulted in the aircraft being diverted to the nearest airport while en route from one city to another. Diversion is a big factor for federal criminal prosecution because it indicates the seriousness of the incident not only to the FAA, but to the United States Department of Justice. If there is a diversion, then it's simply a clue that the passenger, the unruly passenger, and others involved with him or her might be criminally prosecuted at the federal level. Upon landing, unruly passengers may not be arrested or told that they're going to be fined or the like. If this happens, it may be months later before they hear from the FAA or from a government authority like a United States Attorney's Office announcing that the Department of Justice, through a local U.S. Attorney's Office, is undertaking a federal criminal prosecution because of the unruly passenger incident. What we'd like to talk about now, however, is a wrinkle in your traditional unruly passenger case. So far, we've been limiting our comments, Avery and I, to really domestic flights in the United States. But the wrinkle we want to talk about is what happens if an unruly passenger incident occurs on an international flight where the destination, for example, might be New York JFK to Madrid, Spain, or some other international destination. So speaking of that, Avery, what can you tell us about international flights and how unruly passenger events are treated and dealt with on them?
Ed, countries cracking down on unruly passenger incidents have taken the opposite approach. If you land in a country that is part of an international convention called the Tokyo Convention, then wherever the flight is diverted has jurisdiction over the case. This means that however the country chooses to handle these matters, you are subject to their laws by landing there. In response to the pandemic, as we talked about with the United States approach, other nations have also increased their enforcement of unruly passenger incidents. As a result, we've definitely seen a rise in countries and even airlines implementing procedures and laws to handle these incidents. Now, I want to give some examples. As an example of an airline-specific response, Ryanair now issues fines at a minimum of $500 for what they call disruptive passengers. Some countries, such as Canada, now issue fines at a maximum of $100,000 and sentences up to 5 years in prison for these incidents. The UK has implemented fines up to $5,000 and up to 2 years in prison for intoxicated passengers. And for those who threaten safety, they face up to 5 years in prison and will be fined for the cost of the disruption that they cause. This could be really expensive when you're talking about flights that have been diverted, for example. Now, the last country that I want to talk about is Turkey. And Turkey's implemented fines for unruly behavior, including unfastening your seatbelt too early. Think about how often that happens, even on domestic flights in the US. These are just a few responses that I wanted to point out, and we will definitely continue to see more over the next couple of years.
Well, in my view as an aviation lawyer here practicing in Tampa, Florida at Carlton Fields, this is all very interesting. And I want to point out that there are varying degrees of treatment, really enough for an entire podcast episode that we could review. But I think it's important for passengers out there and the public generally to be aware that in federal criminal prosecutions, there can be both a federal criminal prosecution, you see, and an FAA civil monetary penalty imposed. And one of the items that's easy to overlook is that in a federal criminal prosecution, whether accompanied by FAA civil monetary penalty action or not, the judge has the right to impose restitution on the unruly passenger. What can restitution look like in an unruly passenger case? Well, it goes right to this diversion aspect that we've been talking about. Was the flight diverted? The restitution can include, you see, the cost to the airline of diverting to that hypothetical city along the route of travel, an overnight stay, if the crew has timed out under FAA guidelines and cannot continue the flight, the hotel cost of housing the passengers and crew overnight, and the fuel cost for the landing and takeoff, etc., etc. So you see, in addition to the district court judge's ability to impose a fine, which is not restitution, the judge can also, in handling a federal criminal prosecution of an unruly passenger case, impose restitution. And the FAA can impose a civil monetary penalty, which simply is a fine, the goal of which is to prohibit or keep the person, unruly passenger, from committing the act again. So, given that, Avery, can you help us understand a little bit better about the potential disruption of what occurs here when we have an unruly passenger incident and the unruly passenger has already had the benefit of what's called the trusted traveler privileges, such as TSA PreCheck or the Global Entry Program?
I'm happy to do this. I want to expand a little bit more about what TSA PreCheck and Global Entry are. So, PreCheck, as you know, is governed by the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration, while Global Entry is governed by Customs and Border Protection, the CBP. PreCheck expedites the check-in process when you arrive at the airport, and Global Entry serves to expedite customs when you arrive to the U.S. As part of having Global Entry, you also get TSA PreCheck. So while they're different, they serve a similar purpose. They're for passengers who are low risk and otherwise unlikely to pose as a security threat. They've demonstrated to these agencies that they are not someone who the agency needs to be worried about. They don't have a background of certain criminal offenses that would disqualify them. They haven't had issues with flying in the past. And so these agencies don't need to spend as much time screening these passengers during customs or flight check-in as they do for passengers who they aren't sure about their background, right? And so an unruly passenger incident is interesting in the intersection with trusted traveler programs because they can lead to the revocation of trusted traveler program privileges. They can lead to the revocation of TSA PreCheck and Global Entry. As a result of the spike we saw following COVID, the TSA and the FAA entered into an information sharing partnership. There's a press release about this online on the FAA website, where FAA Administrator Steve Dickinson said, "If you act out of line, you will wait in line." Further, he says one unruly incident is too many. As part of entering into this information sharing partnership, the purpose of it was to enforce this zero tolerance policy that we discussed a little bit earlier. As a result of the partnership, we've seen an increase in the number of passengers who have had their privileges revoked following an unruly passenger incident. And again, it's important to mention that whether you have your privileges revoked depends upon diversion, it depends upon the facts of the unruly passenger incident, and it also depends upon the treatment of the incident by the FAA. Was there a civil monetary penalty enforced? Was there a federal criminal prosecution? Did they investigate the reports? Did the report lead to an enforcement action? Ed, can you tell us a little bit more about what a passenger's options are when they have these privileges revoked?
Certainly. I want to make the listeners aware that one of the first things I see in unruly passenger cases is, in some instances, the airline says, "You don't get to travel on our carrier anymore. We're not going to serve you. You are blacklisted." So that's the first one. The second one, though, is that your TSA privileges, PreCheck, can be revoked, rescinded, or That's not really the airline doing that. That's the government. And the third option for is what Avery was talking about with global entry. Those privileges can be revoked and rescinded as well. Now, we don't go to court to do that because this is an administrative agency. The agency, as a result of its discernment of the facts involved in the unruly passenger incident, simply looks at it and says, we are revoking this passengers' TSA and global entry privileges and the like. The airline on its own can blacklist. So what happens here? Well, this is a fuzzy and gray area of the law. TSA has certain criteria that they follow in granting TSA PreCheck, and so does global entry. But really, there are no prescribed laws designating the length of time that they can rescind these privileges for, and no real clear guidelines about when they can give them back. There is a process to reacquire, just like there is a process to acquire TSA privileges and global entry in the first instances. But this means that depending on the facts and circumstances and the severity of each incident, revocation might be permanent. Passengers who trusted traveler privileges have been revoked have a few options. There are mechanisms within both programs, both TSA and global entry, to apply for reconsideration and appeal the decision to rescind or revoke. This is just an opportunity for unruly passengers to explain the circumstances of the incident and provide documentation that would aid someone to understand why permanent revocation may not be necessary. Well, no one likes unruly passenger incidents. That's why they're getting the FAA and TSA and global entries and Department of Justice's attention, because unruly passenger incidents at altitude are dangerous. They're not good for the crew. They're not good for fellow passengers. They're not good for airline or air safety. The FAA is all about safety. And so when they have these incidents, the FAA has ramped up its mechanisms and has encouraged TSA and global entry to do so as well. So, Avery, let's sum up now to help us and our listeners kind of have some takeaway about what we've been talking about as a result of the study that we've conducted. Avery?
So we've seen a decline since COVID. We saw that spike, and now we're seeing cases come back down. We're seeing less. Masks have gone away. People are no longer angry about having to wear masks on planes. And as we saw, with that contributing to so many of the numbers as we returned back to flying, we've seen that come back down. We're on track for 1,600 this year. But despite that number, despite the reduction that we've seen, there's still the same level of enforcement, and which is actually an increase when you compare the number of instances, the number of reports, with the resulting enforcement actions from 2021 to 2023. And we'll see the numbers when they come out for 2024 as well. Additionally, we've seen an increase in TSA and the FAA's involvement in other agencies in helping decrease the number of unruly passenger incidents. This includes the Information Sharing Act that results in the revocation of TSA and trusted traveler programs. We've also seen flights and airlines blacklisting passengers following an unruly passenger incident. We talked a little bit about the risks. You could be fined a lot of money. You could be federally criminally prosecuted. You can lose your trusted traveler program. There's also international repercussions, which is an interesting area to explore because each country takes their own approach. So depending on where you land, you could face different fines. In one country, there might be a maximum of $100,000 and 5 years in prison. Or you could land somewhere like the United States, where there's a maximum of 20 years in prison. So, in being aware of all of the risks associated with unruly passenger incidents, it's important for passengers to remember to fly safe, to stay away from overconsumption of alcohol in flights, and to be aware of their surroundings, the people around them, and the rules of each airline and the FAA. Ed, what should a passenger who finds themselves involved in an unruly passenger incident do?
Well, this is a matter of opinion, but I'd like to share that with the listeners here, and that is this is a very narrow niche area of aviation law. And if you find yourself being scrutinized by the FAA, by the Department of Justice, or local law enforcement after landing, it's important to identify an experienced aviation lawyer who works in this area and who's not afraid to do battle with the FAA, the Department of Justice, or local law enforcement, TSA, global entry, or the other forces that can be used against the unruly passenger. So, how do you find out that person with aviation experience? Well, Avery and I handle these kind of cases, so I would encourage you to reach out to Ed Page, that's me, at Carlton Fields in the Tampa office. You can reach me by sending me an email or calling me at 813-229-4308. My email is epage@carltonfields.com, and I would chat with you about the unruly passenger incident and how we can respond to the government's scrutiny of the unruly passenger's conduct. But I'd also keep in mind Amelia Earhart's quote, and that is, "There's more to life than being a passenger." And so the important takeaway from Amelia Earhart's quote is that there's more to life. It's not over when you have engaged in an unruly passenger incident. We just need to deal with the fallout from it. But the way to do that is to give us a call so that we can help you get through the incident and keep on flying safely in the future.
This podcast is intended for general information and educational purposes only and should not be relied on as if it were advice about a particular fact situation. The distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and receipt of it does not constitute an attorney-client relationship with Carlton Fields.